Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 591, The Artist of the Open Road, Part 1. Over the runtime of this podcast, which is becoming long enough now that it's becoming a little difficult for me to grapple with for existential dread-based reasons, we have talked a lot about art. You might recall that quite some time ago we did an episode on probably the most famous artist in Japanese history, Katsushika Hokusai, episode 202, so it really was a long time ago. And Hokusai was, and still is regarded as, an absolute genius. Not for nothing is the single most famous image he created, the Great Wave off Kanagawa, also one of the most reproduced images in the history of humanity, and possibly one of the most famous works of art just ever. And if memory serves, way back in episode 202, which memory might not serve here because it has been a while, I went off script at one point and said that Hokusai was personally my favorite woodblock print artist. And I still stand by that, to be clear. Again, there's a reason he's as famous as he is. But here's the thing, dear listeners, it's been a while. Longer, again, than I care to admit. My own aesthetic opinions have changed, particularly as I've started very recently getting into photography and thought more about composing images and framing scenes and making artistic choices around faithfulness to reality and all that pretentious nonsense. And as I've pretentiously matured as an artist, I've also come to appreciate more the work of a man who really is the only name you could utter in the same breath as Katsushika Hokusai, Utagawa Hiroshige. In many ways, Hiroshige's career is as legendary as Hokusai's, though the two men were quite different. Hokusai, you might remember, was famous more than anything for his continual process of artistic reinvention. He never really liked to do the same thing twice, and earned a reputation, even in his own time, as a bit of a crazed genius. By the time of his late career, he'd started calling himself his own most famous nickname, Gakkyojin, something like the old man who's crazy about art. Which is a pretty fitting epitaph for a man who was once said to have painted an image of the Buddha on a 200 square meter sailcloth using a broom, and who on another occasion met the literal shogun Tokugawa Ienari during a painting contest, and painted for him by just taking a chicken, dipping that chicken's feet in red ink, and then chasing it around a canvas. Afterwards, Hokusai added a single blue brushstroke and called the resulting image a landscape of the Tatsuta River. He won the contest. You can see why I love him. Hiroshige, by contrast, was a bit more, let's call it restrained and traditional in his approach, relying less on what you could charitably call abstract ideas and less charitably call cheap publicity stunts, and more on careful and precise understanding of how to frame a scene and produce a compelling image. The results are very different, but still very striking. Before we get into them, we should take a moment to refresh ourselves a bit on woodblock printing in general, and second on the specific context of the Utagawa school, because if you know art history from this period, you will know that Hiroshige is far from the only Utagawa running around. First things first, though, we should clarify some terms, starting with three interrelated ones: woodblock printing, nishiki-e, and ukiyo-e. Woodblock printing, to start with, is, as the name implies, a type of printing of images using wooden blocks. This is the kind of keen insight I know you all come to the History of Japan podcast for. Oh, you want more specifics? Okay, fine. Woodblock printing specifically, as opposed to the other common form of printing, movable type, has a history going verifiably back to China's Tang Dynasty. The oldest printed text we have is the Wu-Go-Jing-Guang-Da, Wu-Go-Jing-Guang-Da, a name that I will not try and say twice in the original language with apologies to my old Mandarin teachers, even though the English name, the Great Unsullied Incantation Sutra of Pure Light, is not exactly less of a mouthful. That text dates to the mid-600s CE, which is about 1,350 years ago for the non-mathematically inclined, but we have references to what might be printing technology in written Chinese records going back to the 400s, so about 2 centuries earlier, though no actual printed material survives. I do also want to note here that Chinese inventors also beat that derivative hack Johannes Gutenberg to movable type. The Song Dynasty inventor Bi Sheng created the first movable typeset in 1040 CE, so, as I write this, 985 years ago. However, for Chinese and Japanese as well, movable type just isn't as useful as it is for the Latin alphabet. In English, as an example, you need 26 distinct letters to produce language, plus spaces, periods, all that stuff. You would need thousands of characters to do the same thing for Chinese and Japanese because of the way ideographs work. And so movable type never really caught on. Instead, woodblock carving an image onto a wooden block and then inking and stamping it onto paper became the standard in Asia because working with characters is much easier in that context. In some ways, this is slower. You have to hand make each, say, page of a book instead of just rearranging type on a frame. But it has other advantages that movable type doesn't have. Since you are carving each block, you can integrate text and images in a way that movable type just doesn't allow. That's part of what gives East Asian woodblock prints their distinct look, for lack of a better term. Now, as the name of that first known woodblock printed text might imply, for a long time this sort of printing was pretty much the exclusive domain of wealthy Buddhist institutions, first in China, then Korea, where we have evidence of prints being produced by 1011 CE, and then in Japan, where the technology had spread by the early 1200s. Buddhist temples would print copies of sutras or instructional texts. Generally speaking, temples were the ones with both the wealth to commission artists to make these things, and an interest in using them to spread ideas to a wider population. In Japan, of course, we associate woodblock printing most strongly with the Edo period, the age from 1600 to 1868, that marks both the high watermark and the rapid collapse of Japan's traditional feudal order, dominated by the samurai, the warrior class. And it was during this period that woodblock printing began to spread outside the domain of wealthy Buddhist temples and become more of a genuinely popular phenomenon. As the long peace of the Edo period, enforced by the might of the Tokugawa family of shoguns, began to set in, Japan's commercial economy also began to grow. By 1700, Japan was much wealthier than it had been in the past, thanks to a stable and flourishing domestic trade, which just had not been possible in the earlier centuries of civil war. And this meant suddenly there were a lot more people, from wealthy samurai to artisans and merchants in the cities, with both spare cash on hand to buy art and more publishers and artists than ever before, with the startup cash to supply them with it. And this is, to my mind, one of the really fascinating differences between the histories of European and Japanese art. In Europe, during this time, the iconic genre of art, so to speak, is of course the oil painting, with artists being patronized by specific members of Europe's aristocracy to make images just for them, usually either about a subject that you happen to care about a lot, or a portrait, of course, to stroke your own ego. In Japan, by contrast, woodblock printing was a distinctly commercial exercise. There were separate painters operating during this period who maybe operated in an economic framework closer to what you see in Europe, but for prints, those are not made for specific people most of the time. Usually they were a commercial exercise responding to a perceived demand among the masses for a certain kind of image. Those images could in fact be so popular they present kind of a challenge for a modern researcher. Printmakers with a popular image on their hands would use the wooden blocks to reprint them so heavily, the blocks themselves wore down to basically nothing. It's very rare for us to have a surviving wooden printing block today from this period. This was very much not art for art's sake, but art as a commercial enterprise, which arguably all art is anyway. It's not like Rembrandt was going around doing it for the love of the game. But in Japan, the commercial nature of artistic production during this period is, I think, so much more evident. The question of individual artistic genius versus a fickle market of public taste feels, in turn to me, very modern. It's the same thing a lot of, say, modern content creators struggle with when trying to decide whether or not whatever they want to make is marketable. Anyway, The prints you probably most strongly associate with this period are ukiyo-e, roughly pictures of the floating world. That term, like the origins of woodblocks themselves, is grounded in Buddhism, where the floating world is our own one. The Buddhist ukiyo-e depicts the transient nature of life itself to remind us that nothing in the world is permanent. However, by the 1700s, while the name had been retained, the meaning had shifted. Edo period ukiyo-e are all about this sort of devil-may-care depiction of life's pleasures. If nothing lasts forever, you might as well enjoy it while you can, right? These ukiyo-e could be prints. Indeed, the most famous ukiyo-e are usually prints because, again, they are much easier to mass-produce for a commercial audience in large quantities. But you can also have painted ukiyo-e. Hokusai, for example, was an avid painter in addition to making woodblock prints. In addition, most of the most famous ukiyo-e woodblocks that you know of probably are examples of nishiki-e, roughly brocade pictures. This is a style of printing that developed over the course of the 1700s. Very roughly, because I am not an expert on printmaking, early in the Edo period, prints were usually monochrome, just one color. But over the course of the 1700s, printmakers, in a sort of commercial arms race to compete for market share, developed new techniques to essentially layer colors on top of each other using different inking techniques and sometimes multiple blocks. Thus, by the 1740s, you have images that use 2 or 3 colors instead of just one. By the 1790s, you have the fabulously colored nishiki-e, the brocade images we think of today, so called because the rich color is supposed to remind you of a brocade fabric. The 1790s was also the start, though very much not the end, of another series of innovations in ukiyo-e. Traditionally, the subjects of these images had been limited to a fairly stock set of ideas, usually pictures of famous beautiful women, especially courtesans, and actors from kabuki plays. Precisely the sort of pleasures that, so the thinking went, one was supposed to enjoy in our transient world. Of course, the thing is that in a competitive artistic market, the most in-demand thing is always whatever's new, since that's what's fresh, or more cynically, since that's what allows you to show off what you have to your friends and say, oh yeah, I guess you just haven't seen something like this before because you don't get it, and I'm out on the cutting edge. And so, over time, artists trying to make themselves stand out had expanded their offerings. We've already talked about this in terms of adding new layers of color to images which had once been monochrome, then had 2 or 3 colors, but it applies to subjects too. By the mid-1700s, artists were offering what are called meishō sketches, roughly meaning famous places, a term which had once been reserved for temples, shrines, other religious pilgrimage sites, but in ukiyo, it came to refer to a genre of images of the various legal and quasi-legal red light districts of the major cities, as well as the major kabuki theaters. Hey, pleasures of the transient world and all, right? And I guess for a certain type of pilgrim, that is a famous place. Eventually, this meishō genre came to include not just famous brothels, but also just famous places in general, driven by a sort of feedback loop, you might call it, with other forms of popular culture. For example, back in episode 552, we talked about the comedic travel story Hizakurige, which had been a big hit in the first decade of the 1800s. Part of the reason its author, Jipensha Iku, hit on the idea for that story was the popularity of ukiyo-e travel prints of famous places, and his hit novel drove fresh demand for more images of famous places, particularly ones from the story in turn. I really can't stress enough how important it is to think of this period in kind of commercial terms as a battle for artistic market share. And that battle could be pretty unforgiving. The artistic world, as with basically every other art form during the Tokugawa years, was divided into competing schools of artists in a master-apprentice model. Masters would train apprentices in their style, those apprentices would in turn open their own studios. They would also use an artistic name based on that of their master. One of the very confusing things about the Edo period in general is that people often go by different names. A childhood one, then an adult name they pick when they're older, or maybe several adult names, A name they use as an author, a name they use as a poet, maybe another one if at some point they really get into Buddhism and take either lay or actual monastic vows. It's all deeply confusing. In some cases, artistic names could be legal ones, so to speak. The head of a school of woodblock printing or flower arranging or whatever could adopt a promising pupil and hand the studio over to them, particularly if that master had no biological sons to continue the family name. But even if there was no adoption, pupils would, in an artistic context, use a name derived from their instructors as a signal of their style, so to speak. Confusing? Well, okay, let's take a look at a specific example to make life a bit less abstract. At the start of the 1700s, the dominant school of ukiyo-e was that of Torii Kiyonobu, the son of a famous kabuki actor who had moved to the capital city of Edo, what's now Tokyo, in the late 1680s. He'd apprenticed with famous printmakers in the capital and started making his own prints, first in black and white style, and then in the 1710s, adopting the hot new fashion of 2 or 3 color prints. He also trained 2 disciples, Torii Kiyonobu II and Torii Kiyomasu I. It's unclear what, if any, legal relationship there was between the master and these 2 disciples. Were they his children? Were they just students? It's not really clear. But in an artistic context, the 2 disciples marked that relationship with their instructor by, when signing their work, using the surname Torii and incorporating the Kiyo from Kiyonobu's name into their personal names, or, in the case of Kiyonobu II, taking the somewhat lazier approach, let's call it. This would continue on through the decades with Torii Kiyomasu II and Torii Kiyomitsu and Torii Kiyomoto and Torii Kiyonobu III, and so on down to the present day. The most recent member of the school I could find, and I might be missing someone, again, I'm not an expert, is Torii Kotondo, who died in 1976. But while the Torii school dominated the early 1700s, by the 1760s they had started to lose ground to a new school, the Katsukawa school of ukiyo-e artists led by Katsukawa Shunsho. The Katsukawa school pioneered full-color prints that also tended toward more dynamic scenes. Basically, Katsukawa Shunsho gambled there was a market of consumers who were willing to pay more for his prints, which had more colorful images and more complex poses and scenes, and thus were harder to produce and more expensive, where the Torii school relied more on just volume and comparatively cheaper 1 or 2 or 3 color prints. This worked pretty well. It turned out to be a justified gamble, and Katsukawa Shunsho took 5 disciples of his own: Shunbo, Shuncho, another Shuncho who is not the second because he used a different kanji to spell his name, Shundo, Shun-e. They took students of their own, Shun-en, Shun-gyoku, Shun-jo, Shun-kyu, and so on, and you get the idea. Most of the history of the 1700s ukiyo-e art market could be summed up as a sort of back-and-forth battle between the Katsukawa and Torii schools, with Torii Kiyonaga clawing back some of the lost ground to the Katsukawa, with a focus on more realistic and dramatic scenes. But then we arrive at the 1790s, and by God, who's that with the folding chair from nowhere? It's Utagawa Toyoharu from downtown. Utagawa Toyoharu, actual birth name Tajimaya Shojiro, was born in Tajima Province, now the northern part of Hyogo Prefecture, on the Japan Sea coast in 1735. He would eventually move first to Kyoto, then Edo, studying with famous artists from the Kano School of Painting, and then woodblock printmakers before starting to produce his own prints in 1768. His big pioneering contribution to the genre, something that the Utagawa school would become famous for, is something called ukiyo-e, not a genre he invented, but one he expanded by combining it with the full-color nishiki-e printing techniques made famous by the Katsukawa school. Ukiyo-e are a confusingly named subgenre of ukiyo-e, which make use of techniques derived from the small number of Western prints brought into Japan during this period, most notably 3-point linear perspective, to give the impression of depth. This in turn makes especially landscape scenes look a lot more realistic. The results are quite striking. One of Toyoharu's earliest works from the 1770s is almost a perfect copy of a woodcut by the Venetian artist Antonio Vicentini of Venice's Grand Canal, which is entitled The Grand Canal from Santa Croce to the East, made in 1742. Toyoharu's version wildly misidentifies the location. His is entitled The Bell Which Resounds for 10,000 Li in the Dutch port of Frankái. I have no idea where the hell Frankái is supposed to be, but otherwise it's almost a perfect copy down to the poses of the various boatmen. This is also not the only time he misidentified a foreign location in an early print, by the way. One of his other works, A Perspective View of French Churches in Holland, is actually an image of the Roman Forum, and I have no idea what wacky misunderstandings led to that name. If you're wondering, it's also not totally clear to me how Toyoharu even got the Western prints he was working off of. Material like that was of course controlled via the port of Nagasaki, the only place where the only Western power allowed into Japan, the Dutch, were allowed to trade under restrictions and with their access carefully managed by officials appointed by the shogun. Certainly the Dutch did sell art and other curiosities to Japanese buyers, but not a lot of it to my understanding, so it'd be very expensive. Though, to be fair, by the mid-1700s, anti-Western paranoia had not reached the fever pitch it would by the early 1800s, when a series of Western powers tried to test Japan's seclusion laws, so the laws may have been a little bit laxer, some stuff got smuggled in on the side, not totally sure. Anyway, as you know if you had to sit through a lecture on Renaissance art history in Europe at some point in high school, and based on my experience being in high school and now teaching high school, that's probably all of you. People just go wild for three-point perspective. Once Utagawa Toyoharu started applying this technique to prints of places his potential market had actually heard of and not weird ports in far-off Frankái or wherever, well, it was basically over for everyone else. Utagawa Toyoharu's career took off, and by the last decade of the 1700s, he was the big name of the ukiyo-e world, taking his own students and crushing the Torii and Katsukawa schools he was competing with, in addition to basically everyone else. And as he took up students and built his own Utagawa school, that school would come to dominate the 19th century art world and basically run the Japanese art market, with one exception, down to the literal arrival of photography in the early 20th century. And one of the people inspired by the work of Utagawa Toyoharu was a young boy born in 1797 in Yaesu in central Edo to a small samurai family, by the name of Ando Tokutaro. But, as always seems to be the case when we talk about famous people from this period, that name's not the name you know him by, his artistic name is. And, as is definitely always the case when we talk about famous people from the Edo period, this boy would go through a lot of names over the course of his life before he settled on one he really liked. Utagawa Hiroshige, which, to avoid confusing the hell out of you all, is what I'm going to call him by for the rest of this series, even though at this point we're several years from him claiming it. Now, Utagawa Hiroshige has what probably would not seem like the most obvious background in the world for arguably one of the most famous people in the history of Japanese art. He was, like I said, born into a samurai family, and in the Edo period in particular, you can kind of get a sense of how important a given samurai family was based on how close they lived to the shogun's palace at the center of Edo, what's now Tokyo Imperial Palace. Yaesu is a neighborhood right by the Ginza, today within walking distance of Tokyo Station, is pretty high prestige, not as high as you can get, but it's still pretty good, and as that suggests, the Ando family was not unimportant. In fact, Hiroshige's father had arguably one of the most important jobs in the city. He was the head of a company of firefighters. From time immemorial until after World War II, most of the buildings in most Japanese cities were constructed from some combination of timber and paper, and, well, you can see given that fact why fire was something people took pretty seriously. As a result, Edo had a very serious firefighting culture, with over 24,000 firemen at its peak divided across a city of over 1 million people into brigades responsible for dealing with specific sections of the city. Each brigade in turn was run by a Jobikeshi Doshin, a designated fire warden, who was responsible for, in essence, commanding the firefighting effort. So you would stand in a high place, track the process of the fire, and direct your soldiers, so to speak, to wherever their efforts would be maximally effective. If you're wondering, the usual method of firefighting was to demolish houses that were closer to the fire to cut off its spread. Edo did have good aqueducts that would remain in place until the 20th century, but so far as I'm aware, no pressurizing system that would allow for, say, a fire hose. Anyway, this was an important job in terms of making sure that the city didn't burn down, which is why it was entrusted to someone of the samurai rank, and as samurai, the Ando family were also expected to train as warriors too, as archers and riflemen in case of military emergency. The future Utagawa Hiroshige was the eldest child of this family, expected to take over his father's role when the time came. He was raised in the equivalent of a fire station. Each brigade had a sort of neighborhood compound where the firefighters would reside, with the Ieyasu one being right next to one of the nation's most prestigious schools, the Hayashi Confucian Academy. And Hiroshige always seems to have taken pride in being born a samurai and growing into this heritage, even though this life could be very hard. Because when he was 13, both his mother and his father passed away in the span of about a year, leaving him now the head of household for the Ando family, which also meant he had to take over the family job. That's a lot of pressure for a young kid, and maybe it explains why he started to seek refuge in art. I should note, of course, though, that an interest in art was not unusual for samurai during this period. Unlike older periods of civil war, samurai during the Edo period were expected to be gentlemen of culture as well as fighters. We know that sometime around this period, Hiroshige studied the fundamentals of the Kano school of painting, just like Utagawa Toyoharu had. However, unlike Toyoharu, we're not actually totally sure how he learned them. His name doesn't appear on the rolls of any of the students of any Kano school painters in this period. However, his immediate superior back at the firehouse, the fire sergeant for Ieyasu district, was a samurai named Okajima Rinzai, who had studied with Kano Akinobu at Kano Akinobu's school in Edo. Okajima and Hiroshige would in turn be lifelong friends, so it does seem like the most likely explanation that Okajima was the one who taught him. However he learned painting, the young Hiroshige apparently took it very seriously. Though we don't have any surviving copies, he claimed to have painted scenes of the envoys from the Ryukyuan kingdom coming to Edo to pay homage to the shogun back in 1806. However, the boy eventually moved on from painting, and 5 years later, when he was 15, he presented himself to Utagawa Toyokuni, one of the two famous disciples of the Utagawa school founder Toyoharu, who by 1811 had retired and he would pass away in just a few years. Now, this might raise a question for some of you. First, why would a member of the samurai class want to apprentice themselves to an artist? Weren't samurai supposed to spend all their time modeling moral behavior for the masses and cultivating their inner selves and learning how to fight instead of, working for a living? Well, ideally, yes, but here's the thing. The future Hiroshige was, like all members of the samurai class, paid a yearly stipend assessed in koku, or bushels of rice. But those stipends had been fixed back in the 1600s, and agricultural production in Japan had expanded a lot in the slightly more than a century since then. And as a result, the real market value of those stipends, the amount of currency you got when you converted them into cash on the open market, had gone down substantially because, essentially, of rice inflation, I guess you'd call it. And despite holding a pretty important job, Edo's designated fire wardens didn't exactly rake in the cash, so it made sense Hiroshige wanted to supplement the family income. You might in turn be wondering, okay, you need a side gig, why not work as a painter if that's what Hiroshige had already studied? Why go to a woodblock artist instead? That's a harder question to answer, of course, because we don't exactly have a convenient diary entry lying around where Hiroshige bared his deepest thoughts on the subject for all of us to see. But we can infer things. For example, remember that Hiroshige had studied the basics of the Kano school of painting, but he had not been able to formally apprentice himself with a Kano school master, and that apprentice relationship would be the first step to finding actual professional work. Probably more important, though, was the fact that painting was just not as lucrative commercially as woodblock printing was. The amount of money you could make as a woodcut artist was probably a lot more than you could make as a painter, because the cheaper prices and the fact that any one image could be reprinted multiple times meant that you could make up a lot on volume of sales, so to speak. I don't know for sure that this was a major deciding factor, but given that Hiroshige was in essence taking on a second job to make more money for the family, even if it was a job he clearly cared a lot about, he really loved art, it can't have been too far from his mind. So, Utagawa Hiroshige, the future prodigy, one of the most famous artists in Japanese history, went to Utagawa Toyokuni, one of the two greats of the second generation of the Utagawa school, who was famous for his incredible portraits of kabuki actors and action scenes, who obviously recognized the talents of this artistic virtue. No, I'm just kidding, actually. Utagawa Toyokuni told Hiroshige to buzz off. That's right, the artist who would eventually be recognized as essentially tied for first in the greatest geniuses of the entire Edo period list, the first time he tried to get an apprenticeship, was told to shove it. Why? Well, probably two reasons. First, Utagawa Toyokuni already had a lot of students by 1811. There were the Utagawas Kuninao, Kunimaru, Kunisada, Kunimitsu, and Kunifusa, among others. So he didn't really have room for another apprentice. He also may not have been entirely convinced this young 15-year-old, who had talent, yes, but had trained as a painter, not a woodcut artist, could actually hack it. But again, we can't be totally sure why Toyokuni said no. Thankfully, Utagawa Toyokuni also had the good sense to die in 1825 before Hiroshige really got famous, and thus only posthumously has to deal with being known as the guy who thought Hiroshige was not good enough. And Toyokuni did see promise enough, at least, to recommend young Hiroshige try his luck with the other second-generation Utagawa schoolmaster, Utagawa Toyohiro. And Toyohiro, as it happened, did have room in his studio to take on this young kid. Now we're going to leave Hiroshige's story for here now and quickly close out the episode by talking over the production process for a woodblock print during this time because, for obvious reasons, that's going to be kind of important going forward. As the printing process, and especially the amount of color used in prints, had gotten more complex, printing itself had become more standardized to make the printing process easier. By the time of Hiroshige, there were two basic sizes of paper that were used for making woodblock prints to make the job of the designer and the printer much easier. The kobosho, measuring 350 by 470 millimeters, that's about 14 by 19 images, and the obosho, measuring 390 by 530 millimeters, that's about 15 by 21 inches. Both the kobosho and obosho paper sizes could also easily be split into halves, quarters, or even eighths to produce smaller and therefore cheaper prints. So, if you were an artist, say you are Utagawa Toyohiro looking to show this whippersnapper Hiroshige kid the ropes by producing with him a famous image of a beautiful courtesan, one of the things Toyohiro is best known for, first, you would have to pick a paper size for the print. Usually you would do this in conjunction with the second person in the production process, and possibly the most important, the publisher, the one responsible for coordinating all the different people involved in the process, and paying the upfront cost to produce the prints. This publisher would decide whether or not they felt there was a market for this image, and if they wanted to invest in it, they would take an original work done by Toyohiro and give it to a professional copyist to do a tracing of it. Well, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself here. First, he would take the initial sketch Toyohiro had done and would take it to an official censor appointed by the shogunate to make sure it was not immoral or inappropriate, though depending on the period, the censors could be pretty lax about what that meant. Once you got the approval of the censor, which was indicated by a little seal on the print showing the name of the official who approved the image, then you would go on to the tracer. That tracing, in turn, was passed to a hangishi, or carver, who would take a block of wood, usually cherry since that's easier to work with, and paste the tracing to it. Working on either side of the line, the carver would cut out an outline of the image and then chisel away the required bits to produce an omohan, or key block, used for the actual printing. This is extremely hard to do. The average carver's apprenticeship took 10 years before you were even allowed to try and replicate something on your own. The key block then went to a surishi, a printer, who first applied ink to the appropriate spots using a brush, and then used a boden, a printer's pad, a sort of round lacquered disc wrapped in bamboo leaves, to transfer the ink from the block to paper. You would do some test prints, make any corrections if those were needed based on the tests, and then move on to the final coloration. Here, your original artist returns to the process, so in our example, Toyohiro comes back in, looks at the test images and says, okay, I think this looks good, but I want this section to be this color, and this section to be this color, and I think this line needs to be a bit thicker to emphasize the action, and so on. His notes go back to the carver, who would then cut separate blocks of the image for each color. So one that was just inked for the parts that were red, another that were blue, and so on, and those were the pieces used for the final printing. The workshop of a skilled printer could supposedly produce about 560 finished prints a day once all the pieces were in place. In other words, this is a very involved process. It's why you needed publishers, both to try and determine what would sell and to put the money down to actually finance this whole process. But of course, if you get a hit from it, the returns were very much worth it. This is also why you sometimes hear people speak of woodblock printing as more of a collaborative exercise. Utagawa Toyohiro's name may be the one that's on our final image of our hot courtesan, but he couldn't have done it without a lot of help. The amount of money required to produce an image and the financial rewards if one sold well also meant that competition between studios could be pretty fierce even within the same lineage. Artists from the same generation and lineage would often give each other some space, so to speak, by focusing on different parts of the market. So, for example, Utagawa Toyohiro specialized in these bijinga, prints of beautiful women, while Toyokuni did kabuki actors. And they would sometimes collaborate. When he became more famous, for example, Hiroshige would work with two other Utagawa school artists, Kunisada and Kuniyoshi, on an illustrated version of the Hyakunin-Isshu with prints of each of the poems. For now, we're out of time, so we'll have to discuss Hiroshige's rise from apprentice to fame next week. For now, that's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show at facingbackward.com, and you can support the podcast on Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for part 2.